Don't eat that. Your food has been spiked. The little voice echoed in the restaurant. In the underworld of Busan, Jimpun is a man who fears nothing except the ghost in his soup. He had survived 3 assassinations and a decade of gang wars, but today his death was served on a silver platter, smelling of ginger and garlic. He raised his chopsticks, the poison an inch from his lips, when a small, trembling finger pointed at his bowl. "Don't eat that," a child's voice pierced the silence. "It smells like the bitter sleep." In that moment, the most powerful man in Korea was saved by a girl who wasn't even supposed to be in the room. The scene opens in the Amber Palace, a secluded restaurant. We meet Jimpun, whose tattoos tell the story of a violent rise to power. He is lonely despite his guards. Enter Victoria, the talented chef, and her daughter Isabella. The introduction establishes the contrast, the cold, calculated world of the Mafia versus the vibrant, sensory, and warm world of the mother and daughter. When Isabella detects the bitter sleep, a rare toxin, the tension snaps, and the trajectory of Jimpun's life changes forever. Hello, family. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and stay tuned till the end of this video. Also, subscribe to this channel. Now let's dive into the story. The air in the private dining room of the Amber Palace was thick with the scent of star anise and roasted duck, a fragrance that usually commanded respect. Jimpun, the undisputed head of the Osul Syndicate, sat alone at a table carved from a single slab of obsidian. His neck tattoos, a sprawling map of dragons and thorns, peeked above the collar of his silk shirt. He was a man who lived in the silence between heartbeats, a man who had forgotten the taste of food that didn't come with the aftertaste of paranoia. Across the room, the kitchen door swung open. Victoria, a tall woman with the grace of a gazelle and eyes that had seen the harshness of 2 continents, approached with a tray. Beside her, clutching the hem of her mother's apron, was Isabella. The girl was a striking vision. Her dark, voluminous afro framed a face of intense concentration, and her white sleeveless dress stood out like a beacon of purity in the dimly lit, gold-trimmed room. Victoria placed a bowl of jajampong, a spicy seafood noodle soup, in front of the boss. The steam rose in swirling ribbons, carrying the deep, briny aroma of the sea. Jimpun picked up his heavy silver chopsticks. He hadn't eaten in 18 hours. His body was a coiled spring of hunger and fatigue. As he lowered the chopsticks toward a succulent piece of squid, a sharp, high-pitched cry shattered the silence. "Stop, don't touch it." Isabella's finger was outstretched, trembling but pointed directly at the bowl. Jimpun's hand froze midair. His 2 bodyguards, stationed like gargoyles by the door, reached instinctively for their holsters. "Isabella, what are you doing?" Victoria gasped, her face draining of color. She reached for her daughter, but the girl stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Jimpun's. "It smells like the bitter sleep, Mama," Isabella whispered, her voice echoing in the sudden stillness. "The flower that doesn't belong in the garden. It's in the soup." Jimpun looked at the girl. Most people couldn't hold his gaze for more than a second, but Isabella didn't blink. He saw no malice in her, only a raw, terrified urgency. He looked down at the soup. To his eyes, it was perfect. To his nose, it was delicious. But he had survived this long by trusting the anomalies. "The bitter sleep." Jimpun's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "The white oleander," Victoria whispered, her hands shaking as she realized what her daughter was sensing. "It has a faint, bitter almond scent when heated. It's lethal." Jimpun didn't call for his tasters. He didn't yell. He simply took a piece of the pork from the bowl and tossed it toward a stray tabby cat that often lingered by the restaurant's terrace door. The cat hungrily snatched the meat. Within 30 seconds, the animal began to stagger. Its legs buckled, its breathing became labored, and it collapsed into a silent, permanent sleep. The silence that followed was deafening. Jimpun's guards moved to intercept the kitchen staff, but Jimpun kept his eyes on the little girl. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone in his inner circle had bribed the kitchen, and this child, this tiny Afro-Korean girl with no stake in his war, had just saved his life. "Who prepared this, Victoria?" Jimpun asked, his voice deathly calm. "My new sous chef, Mingkai," she stammered, pulling Isabella close to her chest. "He said he would plate it for you to save me time." Jimpun stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. He walked toward Isabella. Victoria flinched, but the girl stood her ground. Jimpun knelt, his tattooed knees hitting the floor, bringing him eye level with the child. "You have a very special gift, little one," he said, reaching out a hand, then hesitating, realizing his hands were stained with a history she shouldn't know. "You saw the shadow I couldn't see." Suddenly, the restaurant's front windows shattered. A black SUV roared past, a hail of gunfire shredding the silk curtains. Jimpun reacted with the speed of a predator, lunging forward to tackle Victoria and Isabella to the floor, shielding them with his own body as the world outside erupted into chaos. The bitter sleep was only the beginning. The war for the Osul syndicate had officially arrived at their doorstep. The drive to the Siorak Mountains was a blur of high-speed turns and the rhythmic thrum of armored tires. Inside the modified luxury van, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Isabella was tucked under her mother's arm, her large eyes watching the way the city lights faded into the dark silhouettes of the forest. Jimpun sat opposite them, his phone glowing as he barked orders in a language Victoria didn't fully understand, though the tone of search and destroy was universal. "You shouldn't have brought us," Victoria said, her voice trembling but firm. "We are civilians. We have nothing to do with your business." Jimpun looked up from his screen. The overhead light caught the jagged scar on his jaw. The moment that girl pointed her finger, she became a target. "Quan Ho, my second-in-command, doesn't leave loose ends. He knows someone stopped the poison. If he finds out it was a child, he'll use her to get to me, or he'll kill her just to prove a point." Isabella looked at Jimpun's arm, where a fresh graze from a glass shard was bleeding onto his sleeve. Without a word, she reached into her small backpack, pulled out a bright pink bandage with cartoon characters on it, and leaned forward. "You're hurt, Mr. Boss," she said softly. Jimpun stared at the pink bandage, then at his own blood. His guards watched in stunned silence. No one touched the boss without permission. But Jimpun slowly extended his arm. He watched as the small girl carefully applied the bandage over his tattoo. For the first time in 20 years, the cold knot in his chest loosened just a fraction. They arrived at the fortress, a sprawling estate of glass and stone built into the side of a cliff. It was a place of sterile beauty and terrifying security. As they entered, Jimpun turned to his head of security, a man named Sangdi. "Clear the east wing. It belongs to the lady and the child. No one enters without my personal seal." And Sangdi, "Yes, boss." "Find Mingkai. I want to know who paid him before you erase him." The following days were a strange adjustment. Victoria was given a state-of-the-art kitchen, though she felt like a prisoner in a golden cage. Isabella, however, treated the fortress like a kingdom of curiosities. She wandered the halls, her keen nose catching the scent of expensive floor wax, gun oil, and the underlying smell of old, hidden dampness in the stone walls. Jimpun found himself watching them through the security feeds. He watched Victoria cook with a passion that made him realize he had been eating merely to survive, never to enjoy. He watched Isabella dance in the courtyard, her afro bouncing as she chased butterflies. He was a man who lived in a world of gray and red. They were bringing colors he didn't have names for. One evening, he joined them for dinner in the East Wing. Victoria had prepared a simple Kenyan beef stew, the aroma of cumin and coriander filling the room. As Jimpun sat down, he noticed Isabella sniffing the air intently. "Is it safe, little shadow?" he asked, a rare, genuine smile tugging at his lips. Isabella smiled back, her teeth bright against her dark skin. "It's safe. It smells like home." But the peace was a facade. Outside the gates, the syndicate was fracturing. Quan Ho had declared Jimpun weak for hiding in the mountains with a foreign cook and a brat. The pride of the Osul boss was being questioned, and in his world, a question of pride was usually answered with a mountain of bodies. By the second week at the estate, the dynamic had shifted. Jimpun began to realize that Isabella's gift wasn't just a keen sense of smell, it was an extraordinary level of situational awareness. She noticed when a guard was tired, when the wind changed direction, and when the tension in the house spiked. "She sees everything," Jimpun remarked to Victoria one afternoon as they watched Isabella from the balcony. "She had to," Victoria replied, her gaze distant. Growing up as an Afro-Korean child in the smaller villages, she was always the other. She learned to read people's faces before they even spoke. She learned to smell hostility before it turned into a shove or a stone. Her gift is a survival mechanism, Mr. Pun. Jim Pun felt a pang of something he recognized as guilt, a foreign emotion. He had built his empire on the same principle, survival. He decided then that he would not just protect her, he would teach her. He began inviting Isabella into his study, a room filled with ancient maps and hidden safes. He didn't show her weapons. Instead, he showed her the game of stones, Baddock. In this game, Little Shadow, you don't win by killing the enemy, Jim Pun explained, placing a black stone on the wooden board. You win by surrounding them, by making their world so small they have nowhere left to move. Isabella picked up a white stone, her brow furrowed. She didn't place it randomly. She placed it right next to his, a move of surprising aggression. But if I stay close to you, she whispered, you can't surround me without hitting yourself. Jim Pun froze. The logic was flawless. He laughed, a deep, booming sound that caused the guards in the hallway to jump. He was starting to love this child as if she were his own blood. However, the warmth was interrupted by Sangdi entering the room, his face grim. He handed Jim Pun a tablet. The screen showed a video message from Quan Ho. The traitor was standing in the middle of the Amber Palace, Victoria's restaurant. He was holding a torch. You've gone soft, boss, Quan Ho's voice sneered through the speakers. Hiding behind a little girl's skirt. If you don't come down from that mountain and face the council by tomorrow night, I'll burn every memory of your new family to the ground, starting with this kitchen. With a flick of his wrist, Quan Ho dropped the torch. The screen filled with orange flames. Victoria, who had entered the room to bring tea, let out a strangled cry and dropped the tray. The porcelain shattered, the sound of her life's work breaking into pieces. Isabella ran to her mother, her eyes wide with a mixture of sorrow and a new, burning anger. Jim Pun stood up, his face reverting to the mask of the Mafia boss. The little shadow had taught him that life was worth living, but now he had to show the world why he was the man who ruled the shadows in the first place. Victoria, Jim Pun said, his voice like cracking ice. Pack only what you need. We aren't hiding anymore. We are going to take back your kitchen, and I am going to end this. Isabella looked up at him. Are you going to use the bitter sleep on them? Jim Pun knelt one last time, brushing a stray coil of hair from her forehead. No, little shadow. I'm going to use the light you brought into this house. I'm going to make their world very, very small. The descent from the Seorek Mountains was not a retreat. It was a deployment. Jim Pun sat in the back of the armored SUV, his eyes fixed on the rolling fog. Beside him, Victoria was silent, her knuckles white as she gripped her daughter's hand. Isabella, however, was strangely calm. She was tracing the patterns of the tattoos on Jim Pun's hand, which rested on the seat between them. When we get to the city, Jim Pun said, his voice dropping to a protective whisper, you will stay at the safe house in the Blue District. It is a bunker beneath a flower shop. The scent of 1,000 lilies will mask everything. Not even Quan Ho's best hounds will find you. As they reached the outskirts of Busan, the atmosphere shifted. The city felt electric, charged with the news of the syndicate's civil war. Quan Ho had not been idle. He had leaked rumors to the other families that Jim Pun had lost his mind, claiming the great boss was taking advice from a foreign child. Suddenly, the lead car in their convoy swerved. An explosion rocked the pavement, sending a plume of black smoke into the air. Ambush, Sangdi roared over the comms. Tires screeched as a fleet of motorcycles swarmed the convoy. They weren't trying to kill Jim Pun. They were aiming for the tires of the middle SUV, the one carrying the cargo. They want the girl, Jim Pun realized, his jaw tightening. He pulled a heavy handgun from under his seat, but he didn't look at the window. He looked at Victoria. Get down, cover her ears. The windows of the SUV were reinforced, but the repeated impact of high-caliber rounds began to spiderweb the glass. Isabella didn't scream. Instead, she inhaled deeply, her nose wrinkling. They smell like old metal and cheap fire, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gunfire. But there's something else, gasoline leaking nearby. Jim Pun glanced at the monitor. Isabella was right. One of the motorcycles had slid out, and its fuel tank was venting directly near the SUV's rear. Sangdi, sharp left now, use the spark, Jim Pun commanded. The driver slammed the vehicle into a drift. The metal rims scraped the asphalt, throwing a shower of sparks into the leaking fuel. A wall of fire erupted, cutting off the motorcyclists and creating a temporary barrier of heat and smoke. In the confusion, Jimpun's driver veered into a narrow alleyway, disappearing into the labyrinth of the city's industrial sector. They reached the flower shop, the lilac gate, minutes later. As the heavy steel doors of the underground bunker hissed shut, Victoria finally collapsed onto a chair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "He won't stop," she sobbed. "Jimpun, he's obsessed with her now. She's the only witness to his failure." Jimpun looked at Isabella, who was calmly smelling a bunch of freesias on a table, as if they hadn't just escaped a furnace. "He's not obsessed with her," Jimpun corrected. "He's terrified of her, because she represents a future he can't control." 3 days had passed since the ambush. The bunker was comfortable, filled with silks and fine food, but it was still a cage. It was also Isabella's 8th birthday. Victoria had managed to bake a small cake using the industrial oven in the back of the flower shop above. The scent of vanilla and burnt sugar drifted down into the concrete rooms, a stark contrast to the smell of gun oil. Jimpun arrived late that evening. He looked exhausted. The circles under his eyes were deep, and his shirt was stained with soot. But when he saw the small cake with 8 flickering candles, his expression softened into something unrecognizable to his enemies. "I couldn't bring much," Jimpun said, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a small, velvet box. Inside was a pendant, a gold dragon holding a pearl made of black jade. "In my culture, the dragon protects the pearl, but this pearl is different. It is strong and it came from the deep, like you." Isabella took the gift, but then she looked at Jimpun's face. She saw a small cut on his forehead. She didn't ask about the war. Instead, she took a piece of cake and held it up to him. "You have to eat, Mr. Boss," she said. "You're starting to smell like sadness. It's a heavy smell. It makes you slow." Jimpun took a bite. The sweetness was overwhelming. He looked at Victoria, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and growing respect. In this bunker, surrounded by enemies, they felt more like a family than anything Jimpun had ever known. He realized that he didn't want to win the war just to stay the boss. He wanted to win so that he could sit in a real garden and watch this girl grow up. The emotional moment was shattered when the alarm system hummed. The overhead lights flickered red. "Boss," Sangdi's voice came over the speaker, sounding breathless. "The Council of Elders has arrived. They aren't at the headquarters. They are at the front door of the flower shop. Kwanho told them you are hiding a weapon here. They've come to see if you've betrayed the Osul bloodline." Jimpun looked at the birthday cake, then at Isabella. The game of stones had reached its most dangerous phase. He couldn't hide them anymore. He had to show the elders exactly what he was protecting. The Council of Elders consisted of 4 men, all over the age of 70, who had built the syndicate on bones and silence. They stood in the center of the flower shop, surrounded by lilies, looking like ancient vultures. Kwanho stood behind them, a smug grin plastered on his face. "You bring us to a florist, Kwanho," the oldest elder, Mr. Park, wheezed, "to tell us our great boss is playing house." "See for yourself," Kwanho gestured to the floor. The hidden elevator rose. When the doors opened, Jimpun stepped out, but he wasn't alone. He held Isabella's hand on his right, and Victoria stood firmly on his left. The elders recoiled. To see their feared leader with a black woman and a child of mixed heritage was a shock to their traditionalist system. "What is this, Jimpun?" Mr. Park demanded. "Is this the gift that saved you, a child?" "She is not a gift," Jimpun said, his voice echoing with a power that made the glass vases in the shop vibrate. "She is a mirror. She saw the poison your favorite son, Kwanho, put in my bowl. She saw the rot in this syndicate before I did." Kwanho stepped forward, his hand moving toward his jacket. "She's a lie, a distraction. He's using her to hide his weakness. He's gone soft on a foreigner." Isabella stepped forward, moving away from Jimpun. She walked right up to the elders. The guards moved to stop her, but Jimpun's hand twitched, a silent warning that any move against her would result in immediate death. Isabella stopped in front of Mr. Park. She tilted her head, sniffing the air around him. "You," she said, pointing at the elder. You have a medicine in your pocket. It smells like dry earth. But the man behind you, his sleeves smell like the same bitter sleep from the restaurant. The room went cold. Everyone looked at Kwan Ho's assistant, who was standing directly behind Mr. Park. She's lying, Kwan Ho screamed. Check his pockets, Jimpun commanded. Sangdi moved like lightning. He tackled the assistant and pulled out a small glass vial. He handed it to Mr. Park. The old man opened it, his eyes widening as the faint scent of bitter almonds reached his nose. Kwan Ho hadn't just tried to kill Jimpun. He had been preparing to poison the elders as well, to take total control. Kwan Ho, Mr. Park whispered, his voice trembling with rage. You used a child's presence to hide your own treason. Realizing he was trapped, Kwan Ho didn't surrender. He pulled his weapon and fired. Jimpun threw himself in front of Isabella, taking a bullet to the shoulder as the flower shop erupted into a chaotic gunfight. Get them out, Jimpun roared to Sangdi. As Victoria dragged a screaming Isabella back toward the elevator, she looked back to see Jimpun, bleeding but standing, a lone dragon defending the gate. The betrayal was exposed, but the war was now a bloodbath, and the flower shop was burning. The hospital was a stark white contrast to the blood-soaked chaos of the flower shop. Jimpun lay in a private, heavily guarded room, a bandage stark against his shoulder. The bullet had grazed bone, but missed anything vital. Victoria and Isabella sat by his bedside. The fear still etched on Victoria's face, but Isabella was calm, her hand gently holding Jimpun's uninjured one. You took a bullet for her, Victoria whispered, her voice laced with an emotion Jimpun couldn't quite decipher. Why? Jimpun looked at Isabella. Because she deserves a world where she doesn't have to smell death in every meal, because she showed me what I had lost. Suddenly, the door opened, and Mr. Park, the oldest of the elders, walked in, his face solemn. Behind him were the remaining elders, their expressions a mix of awe and grim determination. Kwan Ho had been eliminated in the shootout, but the syndicate was in turmoil. Jimpun, Mr. Park began, his voice gravelly. You saved us from a serpent in our own garden. Your leadership is unquestioned. He paused, looking at Isabella. However, the presence of the child and her mother has caused an unconventional situation. She is my family now, Jimpun stated, his voice firm despite the pain in his shoulder. Mr. Park sighed. The Osul Syndicate has rules, traditions. You cannot lead us with this new distraction. You must choose, Jimpun. You either remain the boss and sever all ties to them, allowing us to ensure their safety in our own way, far from here, or you step down and walk away from everything. The power, the protection, the wealth that is intertwined with the Osul name. Victoria's breath hitched. To ensure their safety, with the syndicate meant Isabella would likely disappear into a witness protection program, constantly running, never truly free. Jimpun, stripped of his power, would be vulnerable, a target for every rival he had ever crossed. It was a choice between two kinds of death. Isabella, sensing the heavy silence, looked at Jimpun. What will you choose, Mr. Boss? She asked, her eyes wide and innocent. The cold stones or the warm cake? Jimpun looked at the elders, their faces unyielding. He looked at Victoria, her eyes pleading. Then he looked at Isabella, whose small hand in his felt like the anchor to a world he never knew he wanted. He thought of the scent of vanilla from her birthday cake, the fierce protectiveness he felt when he saw her dancing, the simple honesty in her voice. He had spent his life accumulating power, only to realize he had been utterly alone. I choose the warm cake, Jimpun said, his voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the room. I choose my family. The elders were stunned. Never in the history of the Osul Syndicate had a boss willingly relinquished his power. Mr. Park, after a long moment, nodded slowly. Then it is done. You are no longer the boss, Jimpun. The Osul will find a new leader. But your life and theirs will be untouched by the syndicate. You will be free, but you will be on your own. Jimpun looked at Victoria. We will not be on our own, he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. We will start anew. Stepping away from the syndicate meant a drastic change. Jimpun was no longer the untouchable boss. His assets were frozen, his connections severed. He kept only the wealth he had moved into legitimate businesses over the years, a fraction of his empire, but still more than enough to rebuild a life. The true challenge was dismantling the remnants of Quan Ho's influence and securing their future without syndicate muscle. Jimpun, Victoria, and Isabella moved to a modest, but beautifully renovated, apartment above a quiet cafe in a less prominent district of Busan. The cafe was the first step of Jimpun's new legacy. He used his deep understanding of logistics and his meticulous nature, once applied to illegal operations, to streamline coffee bean imports and refine baking techniques. Isabella, no longer under threat, began attending a local international school. Her unique ability, once a burden, became a playful curiosity. She'd tell Victoria if a classmate's lunch tasted like too much sadness, a lack of seasoning, or if a flower in the cafe had been overwatered. It smells sleepy. Jimpun, meanwhile, wasn't idle. He knew the syndicate's deep corruption ran deeper than Quan Ho. Instead of using violence, he used the vast network of information he had cultivated for decades. He began anonymously leaking meticulously gathered evidence of the elders' money laundering, illegal land acquisitions, and various illicit activities to a network of independent journalists and prosecutors he had always kept under surveillance. "You're playing a different game now," Victoria observed one evening, watching him sift through documents, not weapons. "The game of stones is still the same," Jimpun replied, marking a complex financial diagram with a red pen. "You surround them. You make their world so small they have nowhere to move. But this time the stones are facts and the board is the law." The cleansing was slow but devastating. One by one, the elders were exposed, their criminal empires crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Scandals rocked the underworld, forcing the Osul syndicate to reform or face complete annihilation by law enforcement. The old ways were dying, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs and the rustle of court documents. The cafe became a thriving success. Jimpun, now wearing tailored suits instead of silk shirts, was known only as Mr. Jin, the quiet, efficient owner who served the best coffee in Busan. Victoria, free to create, expanded the menu with her unique Afro-Korean fusion cuisine, drawing customers from all over the city. One afternoon, Jimpun stood behind the counter, grinding coffee beans, the rich aroma filling the air. Isabella, home from school, was carefully arranging a vase of lilies, her favorite, on a table. She giggled, pointing at a customer who was accidentally putting sugar in his salt shaker. The innocent joy was a stark contrast to the life Jimpun had left behind. He had found peace, not in power, but in presence. Years passed. The cafe, now named the Amber Lily in a subtle nod to their past, flourished. It wasn't just a business. It was a community hub, a place where the scent of freshly baked pastries mingled with the laughter of children and the murmur of contented conversations. Jimpun, once the feared Mafia boss, was now a respected entrepreneur, his past a ghost story whispered by a few, but never fully believed. His tattoos, once symbols of intimidation, were now simply part of his character, softened by time and the warmth of a life truly lived. Isabella grew into a vibrant young woman. Her gift, rather than fatting, had refined itself. She pursued a degree in food science, her unique sensory perception making her an invaluable asset to a culinary research lab, where she worked on developing natural flavor enhancers and detecting food contaminants. She always insisted her mother's cooking was the purest she'd ever encountered. Victoria, radiant and confident, became a renowned chef. Her restaurant adjacent to the Amber Lily, winning accolades for its innovative Afro-Korean cuisine. She had found her own success, building a bridge between two cultures through the universal language of food. But the greatest achievement wasn't professional success. It was the family they had built. Jimpun had officially adopted Isabella, and she proudly bore his family name. He walked her to school, attended her parent-teacher conferences, and coached her on her baduk games, always letting her win just enough to keep her challenged. He watched with quiet pride as she navigated the world with a confidence he had only dreamed of possessing. One warm spring evening, the Amber Lily was bustling. Jimpun stood watching Isabella, now 22, laughing with a group of friends. She was pointing at a plate of pastries, undoubtedly analyzing their hidden notes. He caught Victoria's eye across the room, and she smiled, a knowing, loving smile. Later, as the cafe emptied, Jimpun approached Isabella. "The old elders," he said quietly, "they are all gone. The Osul syndicate, it disbanded entirely. The new generation chose legitimacy over the old ways. Isabella looked at him, her eyes wise beyond her years. You surrounded them, Appa, she said, using the Korean word for father. Not with darkness, but with light. You showed them a different path. Jimpun's heart swelled. He reached out and gently touched the black jade pendant she still wore around her neck. You were always the pearl, little shadow, he murmured, and you led me to the light. The story ends with a final, poignant scene. Jimpun, Victoria, and Isabella sitting together at a small table in the Amber Lily, sharing a freshly baked cake. The scent of vanilla and warmth filled the air, the bitter sleep of the past long gone, replaced by the sweet aroma of family, love, and a future built on genuine connection. Their lives, once tangled in the shadows of the underworld, had blossomed into a testament to love, choice, and the enduring power of a single, brave voice. The end.